Do you want to know almost too much about the 500 series Hasselblads? If so, you've clicked on the right video. I'm going to dive through the history, the lenses, the operation, loading the film backs, what the different numbers mean, what the different letters mean. We're going to go deep on the Hasselblad because this must be one of my favorite and one of the most iconic medium format cameras ever produced. What cameras can claim moon landings in their sort of as feathers in their caps? What cameras can say that they've been used in pretty much the same state and form factor from 1957 way up until 2013? This is the 500 series Hasselblad, and if you watch this whole video, apologies for the length in advance. I mean, I'm sat here recording the intro. I already know this is going to be a long one, but if you watch this, you're going to know how to shoot them, why you might want to shoot them. I'm going to give you an overview of essentially all the advantages and maybe acknowledge some of the disadvantages of this system. But let's get into it, you know, no time to waste when we're covering VMAT Hasselblads. Let's talk a little bit about the history of these cameras because they didn't just spring up as 500Cs. There is a bit of a process to Victor Hasselblad making the first one of these. And it actually starts with a request from the Swedish military to produce aerial cameras to obviously use on planes. During the war years, the Hasselblad company at the time was essentially reverse engineering and building their cameras based on a German camera that they found maybe in wreckage, maybe the plane had to kind of ditch, and they were able to take essentially what the enemy were using and say, this looks really useful, we'd like our own. So they were making those. They were also making watches and clock parts, which sounds like a really random fact for me to throw in, but it is relevant and does come up later. The first Hasselblads made had focal plane shutters, but unfortunately they, despite being kind of great when they worked, had real issues with the reliability. The focal plane shutters covering such a large film area had to be quite big and move quite quickly. So there was a lot of room for mistakes, and apparently the malfunctioning got so bad that a lot of the cameras that were coming off the production lines were actually being cannibalized to repair customers' cameras that were being sent back in. Those were focal planes, and the release of this camera was heralded with the 500C as opposed to the sort of the 1200 or 1600F. And that is a real clue to the kind of shutter, which was the big differentiator when these first came out. 500 just stands for the fastest shutter speed this camera is capable of, and C stands for Compur, which is essentially the manufacturer of leaf shutters, which Hasselblad used at the time. The leaf shutter is utterly iconic for the Hasselblads because they built one into every single lens in their lineup. The advantage of a leaf shutter is just full flash sync at any speed, but the other advantage, and especially a big deal for Hasselblad at the start of their production, was reliability. Because the focal shutters were failing with such kind of awkward regularity, to be able to put something out on the market that was reliable, that did the job, and had this sort of convenience not seen elsewhere in the market, was really good for them. They sold almost 77,000 500Cs. So they produced these. They started in 1957, but the last 500C came off the production line in 1970, which is just an absolute mind-blowing stretch of longevity for what was, yeah, a great product in 1957 and apparently still flying off the shelves in 1970. The last 500 series was produced in 2013, and obviously it went through sort of half a dozen iterations. It was originally the 500C, then the M came along, they released the 501s, they released the 503s, and don't worry, we'll go through and maybe we do it via a chart on the screen, but there are slight differences. This one here I've got is a 503CX, so not the earliest, but not the latest. The CX basically was the introduction of the off-the-film flash metering system. You can see the little film-facing sensor on the left there, which is a great boon for studio photographers. But I'll be honest, I haven't used it as a CX once, so for me, this might as well be a 501 CM, or even a 500 CM. So famed were these Hasselblad cameras for that combination of ergonomics, portability, I guess reliability by this point with their fancy leaf shutters, that in 1962, NASA got in touch and essentially said, we want these cameras to use on the Apollo missions. Can we work with you? Can we modify one of your existing cameras for our needs? The interesting thing about the NASA adjustments was that for the most part, they were simplifying the cameras. The astronauts with their big gloves essentially couldn't operate some of the functions. And if you look at stuff like this on the lens barrel, sorry, I have to block my face entirely for the focus to work. But the rings are a bit finicky, and I think the aperture rings like this are essentially pared down to its f8 or f16. They actually, interestingly, published the manuals that they used to train the astronauts in the use of the Hasselblad cameras, and I think that they didn't teach them how to meter. They just said, if the sun is on you, this is the meter reading, and if the sun isn't on you, this is the meter reading, which makes a lot of sense because in space, it's not like clouds are going to interrupt your metering thing. Anyway, weird digression. They used 500 series cameras in space, and I think the first camera to have a motor drive installed into it was the 500 EL, which the Apollo astronauts took to the surface of the moon and left there because the weight and the trade-offs for the kind of the taking off from the moon meant that what the astronauts did upon getting in the module was break the camera off here and throw that onto the lunar surface. The magazines came back to Earth, but if you're planning on getting rich quick, there are 12 Hasselblad EL bodies up on the surface of the moon, and I am just conservatively estimating about sort of $2-3 million at auction each, if you can find them. I mean, honestly, what better advert is there than having NASA using your kit on moon missions? In the era when they were sort of publicly landing on the moon, televising it, late 60s, early 70s, the camera to have was one of these Hasselblads. If you think about all the famous album covers, portraits of celebrities of that era, I'm thinking of the Storm Thorgerson Pink Floyd covers. They're all shot on the Hasselblads. You know, it's just absolutely perfect. You get that square crop, so your album cover is going to look great on the vinyl sleeve. The 6x6 format was more standard then, and nowadays is becoming less and less common as people display media differently. Essentially, the 6x6 is seen as wasted space, but I'm quite happy cropping my 6x6 images. If you think of the efficiency that the 6x6 system affords, because you have a no necessity to rotate the camera, it means that you don't have to have a rotating back and that your image circle is most accurately filled. Let's think about something like something really panoramic. If you think of the Hasselblad X-Pan, another fantastic camera, but super inefficient in terms of image circle, because the image has to fill the widest point wherever it comes on the negative. The rest of that image circle is essentially discarded, and the lens, the optics, all have to account for something that never gets used. With a 6x6 camera, you can have the image circle cover as closely as possible. I mean, I say as closely as possible. You could have a circular back somehow and only use the image circle. That doesn't really stand up to much scrutiny. But the combination of 6x6 or the 1:1 aspect ratio means that you have the best image quality in the smallest possible package. The ergonomics of these are sort of time tested, because you don't essentially, if they were bad in the 70s and they were sort of revised and improved and upgraded a dozen times, you'd expect them to change anything that was glaringly bad. One of the most charming things I find about this camera is that there is no electronic kind of battery required for any part of its operation. In the war years, Hasselblad clearly worked out something to do with clockwork, because they got pretty good at it by the end. The whole operation of this camera, interlocks, the shutters, every part of its function is controlled and sort of interlocked with everything else. For example, I'm going to show you some mistakes that the camera stops you from making. If I take the dark slide out, mechanically, the button that removes the film back is now locked. I'm not allowed to use that. The camera says, if you pull the back off now, you're going to expose your film, you're going to waste your film. You can't do it. Likewise, when you have the film wound, the camera shows you down here these two little white windows to say the back is ready and the camera is ready. This back's actually loaded with some film, but look what happens. If I take this back off and release the shutter, upon putting the back on the camera, you can see that I have two little flags, one red and one white, essentially saying, be aware, the camera has been released, but the back hasn't been shot onto. Don't wind on, because if you do that, you're going to waste some film. Now, obviously I know that I haven't shot that, so I'm going to take it off, wind it on, and now you see I get that white flag that shows that it's ready to go with its film back. I love that kind of combination of clockwork and incredibly high precision requirements. Like these shutters can do, and they can do it sort of accurately for decades. 1/500th of a second down to 1 second. And I haven't checked it with one of those laser things, but they seem pretty accurate. I've shot slide film using these, and the accuracy there is obviously tolerant to about 1/3 of a stop before you really start noticing what you've done wrong. And these shutters hold up. The other big plus about these systems is that they're just incredibly modular. The base configuration of the camera, which I guess is shown here, is just the standard waist level viewfinder, the body, the lens. I mean, I can even take the lens hood off to simplify, and the back. And this is what I guess you get out the box, or this is if you do buy a Hasselblad, they always come with an 80mm lens, and you'll always get at least that package. It might turn out that you're not intending to use it purely like this, but there are an absolute assortment of accessories for this. The camera strips down so easily, and I'll just do this now to show you a real look at what the camera can turn into. So the viewfinders can be exchanged. That is essentially, by the way, that's a Hasselblad 503. This looks like a strange cube of metal and glass, but this is the camera, because this is the back and that can be exchanged. And then we have the lens and the viewfinder separately. So I can make sure to put this in front of my face. Let's configure the camera for something different. So let's say that the waist level viewfinder is all well and good, but that you prefer to shoot at a different angle. You can easily go and pick up something like this, which is, I think it's a PM45 metered prism. Honestly, look, it's like adult Lego. It just slides on like that. On goes the back, and on goes the lens. And you've got a camera now that's not only suitable for eye level shooting, but you have a meter built into these. It's not connected to the shutter in the way that you can get on things like the later Mamiya's. But the interesting thing is these meters actually give you a reading in EV, which is another interesting thing. So I looked through this, it says 12 EV. So if you look down here on the lens barrel, you can see these numbers, which are correspondent EVs, and you can just go around, choose your EV. So let's put this one on 12. And now you have a very interesting function, which is this lever here, when depressed, will only allow you to choose combinations of shutter speed and aperture. That will give you correct exposure. It's so well thought out that you just start using it and you don't pay much heed to, wow, that was a neat idea. I mean, all these stops are interlinked. Maybe that's something that you'd expect to see on modern cameras even. I guess when you put them in auto exposure mode, they do that. If you stop your aperture down by 1 stop, your shutter speed will do it. But for a completely mechanical clockwork camera to just have a little button that does that for you, I really enjoy it. I think that's a fantastic way of shooting. Right then, let's get going with this. This stuff's a little bit dry, but in the interest of thoroughness, I'm going to start at the top. The 500C is the one that we've been talking about, and really with the 500C, they get 90% of the way there. What follows are a series of modifications, small adjustments. The first of this is the 500CM, and the M in this is actually just modifiable. This is the first one that allows the user to interchange the focusing screens, so you can get the brighter acute matte screens. Previously with the 500C, a technician has to do it. So the 500CM says, choose your own focusing screen, do whatever you want. People put the kind of grids on, you can get the prisms. The 503CX came out in 1988. This is the one that I have, so it's the one that we're looking at throughout this video. The Palpus coating is to stop internal reflection, but as far as I can tell, it doesn't make a huge amount of difference. It does crack with age, but so does the old stuff. So it's technically an improvement, but one that I don't really see. The CX also came with the acute matte screens as standard. That was their big kind of upgrade for the focusing screen. So after the CM and the availability of acute matte screens, they started just putting them in all the cameras. The old ones are a bit of a step down. The CX also had TTL off the film flash metering. What that means is that with a special adapter, I think made by Metz, you can just point your camera at a scene, and the flash as it fires is measured by a little diode inside the camera, and it will cut off your exposure when enough flash has been received. Now, I shoot this Hasselblad with flash the whole time, and I've never used the TTL function. I don't have one of the Metz meters, but the thing is, I have a Minolta flash meter that I can use, and it doesn't really matter to me that I'm not able to use it with TTL. So maybe if you're using it handheld with an on-camera flash, this would be useful to you. That's just the CX is the one that works with TTL flash. The CXI is the upgrade to the CX, and what they do is they make it compatible with the winders, which are also used on the CW. They kind of stick on the right side of the camera, and they give you the ability to automatically advance, and they have a shutter in them as well. The CXI also increased the range of ISO values that the TTL off the film metering system was able to handle. So if you wanted to use, say, 4000 ISO film with 500, then the CXI is the one you need to go for. The 501C is like the 500CM, but strangely it's almost pared down. You do get a more modern body if you buy one of these, but they take off the ability to remove the winding crank, and there's no little flag window on the body to show you whether it's cocked or not. The 503CW is one of the most advanced ones. It's essentially a 503 CXI with the new acute matte D screen. The winders are the same as the ones for the 503 CXI. You can look at the dates, they overlap in quite a weird way. But the big advantage of the CW is something called the gliding mirror system. Now, when you use a focal length above or around 150mm on any of the previous Hasselblad bodies, you get a strip at the top of your focusing screen where the image vignettes, and you essentially have a black bar that is a bit of an obstruction to composition. I don't know if you're really focusing on things that are right at the top of your focusing screen, but it can lead you to kind of offset your negative. It's not ideal, and the 503CW introduced this mirror system, slightly larger mirror, a different mounting system that does increase the ease of focusing with longer lenses. You pay a huge premium for it though, and I've been using 180mm on the CX with really no issue. The 501CM is essentially the 503CW with the winder adapter thing and the TTL OTF metering system removed. The most advanced one's definitely the CW, but the 501CM is everything you need if, like me, you're not using it with TTL flash or a winder. Let's talk a little bit about the viewfinders for these cameras, because obviously it's all well and good having the camera, but if you can't focus it, it's not particularly useful. We've got a classic top-down waist level viewfinder, and because the ground glass is only sort of presented with one mirror, the image is inverted horizontally. If I wave my finger in front of it, you'll see that as my hand moves across the screen in one direction, the image on the screen is obviously horizontally flipped. You get used to it. It's a bit of a quirky thing at the start, but once you've shot it for a while, you actually find that sometimes it aids in composition, where you're seeing the scene in a more kind of abstract, formal sense than just looking at what's in front of you. The viewfinder also has a little pop-up focus aid. Having a bit of fun with my slow motion here, but if you see, there's this little panel that comes up, and actually if your eyesight isn't perfect, you can even get the little screw-in diopters of different prescriptions. So that's really useful, especially if there's a bit of glare, or if you're really focusing something that has shallow depth of field. Maybe you're using a 180mm lens, maybe you're using a macro lens. Very useful. So quick aside about Hasselblad lenses, you'll notice that mine have a little bit of sticky tape on top of them. The reason for that is that all Hasselblad lenses of certain eras are completely identical when you look at them from above. If you imagine looking down into your camera bag and having multiple lenses, especially these, which are exactly the same height, normally I can pick out the 180 because he's a bit taller than the rest. But the sticky tape is necessary because the lens hoods, and I guess also the filters and the hood adapters are all cross-compatible. You can see I can change the lids over, which is a bad idea because all I'm going to do is confuse myself next time I use this. This series of lenses that I've got are CF lenses. So the original lenses are called C lenses. It just stands for Contour. And they're the ones that look silver, or they're kind of that old style. You look at them and you go, that's something from the 50s, and it is. They're pretty old and they look pretty old. The CF are slightly later. The F is a callback to the naming convention established between the focal plane cameras and the Contour cameras, or the leaf shutter cameras. The F stands for focal plane compatible. And all that means is that if you are using one of Hasselblad's focal plane cameras, which people did, I think people would have sort of one body of each at some point because of the faster shutter speeds. If you're using fast primes in daylight and you don't want to use neutral density filters, obviously 1/2000th of a second might be a big deal for you. Or if you want to freeze faster motion. The CF lenses are a little bit more modern. These are kind of like 70s, 80s. The more modern ones, and I think in the 90s they started to go into things like CB lenses. The B is a bit insulting. The B stands for basic, but don't worry if you've got a CB lens, they're still great. And the later ones than that are things like the CF FLE with floating lens elements, or the CFI. The I actually stands for improved. The lenses are all good. The Hasselblad system was a partnership with Zeiss from the beginning. And the lenses almost have like that weight of visual history behind them. You've seen all these album covers, you've seen all these portraits of the kind of influential figures of the 20th century. And I guess that modern lenses might be better corrected, but you don't have like kind of bad areas of the Hasselblad lens world. Pick up a C lens, the really sort of dinky 50s looking ones, and you're still going to get fantastic results from it. The widest lens they made was a 40mm, but we should talk a little bit about crop factors because there's some weirdness going on there. The system, obviously, the crop factor, as people know it, is always referring back to 35mm, but with a camera like this, where your negative is so much bigger, your angular view is sort of like reverse cropped. The crop factor for these is 0.55, which means that the standard lens for the system, which is the 80mm planar, is closer to like a 45, 46mm. And don't get me started on whether I'm talking about the horizontal field of view, the vertical field of view, or the diagonal field of view, because the aspect ratio changes, so the equivalent is pretty wild. I will give you, off the top of my head, the knowledge that the 50mm lens, which is the second widest lens in the system, I believe, has a horizontal field of view of 32mm, but a vertical field of view of 21mm. When converted to 35mm equivalent, Sounds very technical, but essentially, when you have a lens like 50mm, which sounds like a standard, it's pretty wide on something like this. So the widest lens was 40mm. The most tele lens was 500mm. And I should put a picture of it up because it's a beast. I mean, imagine carrying that thing around to sort of location to location. They also made a rather quirky zoom lens, the 140 to 280mm. I've never even seen one of those. I think that they didn't sell so well because they're obviously quite awkward, and I don't know when the primes are this good whether you need a zoom lens for such a sort of chaotically oversized system. The thing with the lenses is you're always going to have an 80mm 2.8. So if you're going to pick one up, you can sort of see it as your wide lens, and for that, really, the 50 is the only one to go for because the 40 is astronomically, or I'd say exponentially more expensive, and the 50 is just great. The other end of the spectrum is the portrait lens or the tele lens, and you have two options. The 180, which you can kind of guess what I'm going to say, can't you? Because I've had to make this decision, and you can see the results of me making those decisions. But the 180 is fantastic, but it's a little bit tight sometimes. The 120 macro planar is fantastic and also optimized for close focus. I would say there's one in the middle. So if you're going to get one lens, get the 150. If you're going to get two lenses, maybe look at these two. Or there's the 100mm, which is incredibly I mean, people always go on saying it's like the sharpest lens ever. But I don't know. I mean, to be honest, I mean, I should say this for all film photography. This is just a general statement. Don't read obscure internet comment sections about lens sharpness if you're not scanning on a drum scanner. If you're scanning on an Epson, all the lenses look the same. They'll all be fine. Just look at the kind of maximum aperture and the focal length, and that's what matters. Okay, so we've talked a bit about the kind of operation of the camera, but one of the most important things with these is the loading process. It is possible to screw up, and there's nothing worse than finding out after you believe your roll to have been finished that you have made a mistake. So I'm just going to go through this now on camera so that you guys essentially know what to do and know what not to do. So I can get rid of my little Neopan sticker because I've shot that roll. Let's just take this off the camera. You can just take the tray out and load it on the back of the camera, but for the purposes of this, let's just do it the intended way. Your dark slide, by the way, is going to have a slight asymmetry to it. I'll just pull that up because that is quite relevant. But if I take this sheet out, can you see that there is a little curl to the metal? What you want to do is make sure that the little curl is facing outwards whenever you put it in. What that means is that you can take the internal tray out of the dark slide without it interacting with the dark slide itself. So that just is good practice every time you put it in. This is the insert for one of the Hasselblad backs. You have the sprocket, which holds your 120 roller, and obviously you have it on both sides. Whenever you finish a roll, you actually take it from here and you move it across to the other side, but I've already done that apparently. Let's start loading a roll, and I'll show you the correct way of doing things. So open the packet. Let's just put that out of shot. Okay, so I've taken my paper off, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by just gently lifting up on that bit so that I can get the roll to line up. I'm just going to gently rotate it with my fingers until it clicks into the right place. You want to have this sort of end of the film at the bottom of the roll, so it is possible to put this on upside down. Make sure that you have it that way up. what you want to do is you want to take this end and run it over the back like that, not very far, and you want to be quite delicate with it. The pressure plate actually has a little lip, and I'm wondering what the best way for me to show you is, but if you watch here, as I turn that, can you see that little pressure plate lifting up? I want it in the up position, because what I'm going to do is I'm just going to slide my film under it as I continue going around onto the take-up spool, which is at the other end of the reel. There's a little slot on this, and what I'm going to do is, using my other hand just to keep pressure on the back, I'm going to pull out a bit of film, poke it through, and I can just start turning this. Sometimes it's good to keep a finger on it here, because you can use that as a technique to stop it from essentially pulling out and doing its own thing. So gently turn this, and what you're looking for is to have your film rolling off the film, coming around the back, and then going onto this wheel. As I turn this, you'll see that I'm pulling the film across, and if I do this 2 more times, maybe 3 more times, you're going to see an arrow appear. So here we go, there's the arrow. This arrow here is the essential starting off point, and it's where you stop turning this. You can check your arrow is correct by this little red arrow on the top. So when those line up, you can see actually, if anything, I've gone a bit too far with that, but there's a little bit of tolerance. If you see that your arrow is lined up with your arrow, all you do is you take your magazine and you slide it in. Obviously, the tolerances are quite tight. It's not going to go in the other way up, so slowly go in like this, and make sure that your film is fully on. Make sure you pressed it down, and then turn your clip, close your lid, and that magazine is ready for the next step in the loading process. Can you see here, this little window currently at the bottom just shows nothing really. It's like a kind of black porthole. So what you want to do is take this little lever out, and you can actually do this on the camera, but there's no reason to. Just turn this wheel, and this is where we start to examine the A part of the A12 back. If I just keep turning this round, round and round, eventually it will stop automatically. I didn't stop there, it simply won't go any further. At that point, I'm just going to turn it back a bit and then close it into the little holder. If you look in the little window, you can see a 1, and that means this back is correctly loaded to its first frame. So one thing that's really important when it comes to choosing your Hasselblad is the focusing screen. Now, these have beautiful classic waist level viewfinders, and the brightness of your focusing screen is incredibly important to the usability of the camera and the ease of focusing, ease of composition. The 500C didn't come with the brighter screen. They're called Acute Mattes, and I think the D-type is the one that people get most excited over. This one is an Acute Matte, but the Acute Matte sort of original rather than the Acute Matte D. And I have looked through one of the older screens. They really don't make things as easy. If you want a newer focusing screen, then you can look at a camera that has either a 1 or a 3 in its name. They'll often have the Acute Mattes. Or you can look at the 500cm, and the M in this naming convention stands for modified. It means that you can go in and you can manually adjust your focusing screen. Some people like to have multiple ones. You can have one with a split prism, you can have one with a grid on it. You know, focusing screens, I mean, there's like third-party options. You can get ones that have frame lines for different formats. I do recommend getting one of the Acute Mattes, not necessarily the D screens, and if you look on eBay, the prices those things are running for now is pretty crazy, but do look at getting one of the later screens. That is worth it and will give you a better time using the camera. Let's quickly go over some of the other accessories for the system. You can get these sort of changeable lens hoods. And these are great if you want to be able to take one lens hood for multiple lenses in the system. So if you see here, I can set this to different focal lengths along the CF line. I can go to 50 for my widest lens, 80, and you can see as I do that, let me hold that up to the camera so you can see. Essentially, I'm sliding the bellows along this rail to make the hood suitable for the focal length in question. I actually even have a drop-in plate for the 180mm that gives it a little bit better sort of matte box protection. But these are pretty cheap and convenient when you don't have a hood for each one. You can also get the plastic hoods, and Hasselblad do a funny thing where most modern lens manufacturers will give you the hood for their lens. The Hasselblad ones will say this hood is suitable for, in this instance, 100mm to 250mm. So I can use this on the macro planar or the 180 sonar. Other Hasselblad accessories that are worth noting is this little guy here. Now, this must look like the most boring accessory ever, but you'll notice that every 500 series camera has that same little metal shoe on the base of it. What you do is you can just slide the camera in its normal kind of unpackaged state onto the plate. I'm not going to screw this onto a tripod for demonstration, but imagine this is on a tripod, and then that one little lever just locks this thing down, absolutely solid, not going anywhere. And one safety thing, which I absolutely love that they put on, because I have had situations, maybe even on video, where the plate is not aligned properly and the camera is kind of held in, is they have a little safety pin on the bottom that you have to push in order to slide your camera out. These things are so cheap and so useful that I cannot imagine another Hasselblad product that has the same usability to cost sort of benefit to it. Honestly, spend £20 and save loads of time, loads of stress, and like just have more fun using your camera with tripods. I can't recommend these enough. They also have an extensive lineup of extension rings. This one here is one of the E extension rings, which essentially were made for the later cameras, and I think particularly for the focal plane cameras. But you can find the old C style or even CF style extension rings. They're not the most common accessory to find, so if you want to have a look at a specific one, you might have to set up an eBay saved search. You can't just find them sort of in any local camera shop. But the extension rings are essentially a way of achieving macro focus with any lens. There is a chart online. You'll have to look up which focal lengths will give you which close focus and which magnification ratio. But these are super simple. They go on behind the lens, but the most important thing to remember is that when using one of these, you build the camera system from the camera forward. If you put this onto the lens and then onto the camera, you might have problems. What you do is you put it onto the camera first, and then the lens on. So now I've got my my macro 80mm. Obviously, I can no longer achieve infinity focus, but I can focus a lot closer. That's, I mean, you know what extension rings are. I just want to really sort of dial in this point. When you're using extension rings on a V-mount system, you always take it, you build it, camera out to the lens, and you take them off, lens back to the camera. The reason for that is, with these systems, because the shutter, and actually I'll show you that little screw, or maybe we do a cutaway to a close-up. Because the shutter is trippable by manipulation of that little thing there, which I shouldn't really be playing with like I just did. If you allow that thing to fire, you can get situations where the lens and the body no longer talk to each other. You can get them jammed, which is a nightmare, and the kind of the solution to this is extension ring on the body, lens on the extension ring, and then when you take it off, lens off, extension ring off. And now, as proof of my sort of overstressed ideas, we have a lens on the body that can still fire. That would be embarrassing if that didn't go, wouldn't it? Whilst we're talking about do's and don'ts with these, I'm also going to show you another mistake that people make when they're new to the system. Just going to change viewfinders for this, and you'll see why, because what I want to do is give you a good look at the mechanism that allows you to put the backs on the camera. So let's say we've just shot this roll of film and it's time to change the back. It's going to hide behind the body. So what you can do is line the thing up like that and just slam. And I'm not going to do it because I'll tell you why in a sec. But if you do this and just slam, it will close and that works. But it's really bad because behind this little logo here is a little mechanism with a spring in it that, if pressured like that over a long working lifespan, will essentially fail and you won't be able to get your back off the camera, or it will essentially fall off the camera at inopportune times. The trick is, what you do is you push the base on, as usual. Let's put this up close so you can see what I'm talking about. And just as you're going in, pull the catch, close it, and then release the catch. It's the difference between putting kind of a snap of wear on a spring and then putting some slow pressure on and then slowly taking it off. It will extend the lifetime, and you know, if you mess around and you start slamming the back on, that when it does fail, it will be right at the most sort of inopportune moment. So protect the lifespan of your camera, and yeah, be nice to the backs, and they'll last another 50 years. I mean, this one's pretty new, but you can get backs that are sort of 50 years old. So yeah, give them a bit of get a bit of good treatment, and they'll do you well. When using these V-mount cameras, it's incredibly important that you wind on after taking every single shot. The habit of it isn't so bad. You just got to get used to. And for your information, this is an empty back. I'm not just going to start wasting film. But if you press the shutter, just think that sound in your head must be associated with getting your lever and winding on your film to the next frame. If you don't do that, there are several pitfalls that can essentially cause you trouble. And I'll go through a couple of them now. So first, if you do fire your shutter, I don't know why I took my dark slide out because I'm going to be demonstrating the shutter again. If you do fire your shutter, you'll notice that the lens, I really don't want to do this. I'm so nervous. Okay, so the lens shutter isn't cocked. So if I press that in, you'll see that, okay, I can't express the force that I'm putting on the lens. I don't want to put too much, but I'm putting a bit on. But you'll see I'm pressing the shutter, the lens release button down and turning it, and it won't come off. Now, the reason for that is that if you look into the front element, you'll see that the lens actually isn't cocked. If I get a bit of light on it, you can see those closed leaf shutter blades. If I was to take the lens off the camera, if I was then to cock the camera, the lens couldn't be attached because you got to think about that screw. They wouldn't line up. They'd meet at the wrong angle. So the camera says to you, what are you doing trying to take the lens off? You must wind it, then you can take the lens off. And if you forget to do that and you do manage to force it, which there's no way I'm going to do for this video, you'll be in trouble. You'll have a lens that can't come off the camera, a camera that won't release the lens. You're not going to have a good time. So don't do that. But if I wind it on, it shoots again. That's fine. That's a worst case scenario, but a slightly less worst case scenario is also possible if you don't immediately wind on. And I'll show you this. If you look here in this little window, you'll see that I've got 4 frames shot. So what we're going to do now is we're going to shoot, okay, and we're not going to wind on. So I've just taken my shot, and let's say that's it, you know, end of the shoot, dark slide goes back in the camera, and the back comes off. Right, that frame that I just shot hasn't moved from its position just behind this dark slide. So look what happens now if I wind the camera on. So I've got a camera system that's wound and a back that isn't wound. Now, the little window on the back says red. It basically is a warning saying, you do realize that if you don't wind this, you're going to lose your frame or double expose it. but the camera is showing white. So what I'm now going to do is, having shot the back, removed it with a dark slide in, and then rewound the camera, I'll show you what the problem is. If I now put this back on and remove the dark slides, and I'll show you just in that little close-up that we have got mismatched little flags. Problem's really simple. If I now shoot this camera, I'm going to expose the same piece of film which I exposed in my previous shot, and I'm going to double expose. Maybe you want to double expose because you like the effect, and if that's the case, then I've also just taught you how to double expose using a VMAT Hasselblad. But if not, there is no prevention on me taking that shot with the back that's not been wound. So if you look, it's still on the fourth frame. The fourth frame has just been exposed twice, and your shot has been double exposed, whether you like it or not. Let's wind that on. This is something just drill into your head. You've taken a picture with a VMAT Hasselblad. Now it's time to wind it, and you'll never have problems if you keep to that religiously. Another interesting function of these cameras is that there's an inbuilt mirror up lever that trips the sort of body shutter before the lens goes off. So if I give you the close-up again, let's say that I'm doing a kind of a long exposure shot, maybe something like my last video with the across and the tripod, and I want to just get that mirror slap out of the equation. What you can do is you can press this little button here on the side, and what this button does is it locks up the rear curtain and the mirror, so that all the shutter is linked to is the little leaf shutter in the lens. You'll see that the shutter is closed at this point because obviously the only thing between the film and the lens aperture is this little metal curtain. So what am I on? Bold mode? Let's go on bold mode. You'll see now that the only thing that changes when I press the shutter is that little click, and that's just the kind of the smoothest operation. When you release it, you can hear that the little compo shutter closes, and actually the focal plane shutter closes at the same time, the curtains at the back. If you shoot on shutter speeds, by the way, between 1 second and 1/4 of a second, you can see that from the little orange line, then it's important that you hold this button down because of that discrepancy between when the shutter closes and when the curtains close. Let me explain that better. I think that I've sort of glossed over that. I don't need the viewfinder because I'm just doing test shots. I'm going to take the back off, and that I think will help me explain this a bit more fully. So, dark slide in, just because the back doesn't let you take it off. Okay. So this is an example of a 1 second exposure. And you'll see, maybe it's best if I show you the back of this actually, that when I press this, the back opens and then the little shutter closes. And when I release the pressure, you see my thumb is holding it. When I release that, the rear baffle closes. The important thing to be aware of is that if you just jab the button, the little timer in the lens isn't going to keep your rear curtain open. So what you'll get is essentially a bulb exposure of how long you tapped the button for. The same thing is true all the way up to 1/4 of a second. So you can see Hasselblad put this little orange line on those shutter speeds to remind you. But it is good habit. So when you press the button, let me just move this out of the way so you can see. So you press, and now you can see the shutter's closed. And when you hear that second click of the leaf shutter closing, then you release this and the back closes. The trick is hold the shutter button down and make sure that your exposure has finished when you release the shutter, so that when the mirror comes, when the rear curtain closes, you're not curtailing your exposure. I also want to quickly touch on the backs. Now, you've just seen me load it, but the A12 isn't the only type of back Hasselblad did. They also have the 6x4.5 backs, or they're called the A16s. A, by the way, just stands for automatic, because the original ones you had to like wind on and look through a little window at the back, and these ones, they stop when you get to the right point. That's all A means. So A12 is just automatic 12. The A16 backs are useful, but they do require you to use a mask in your viewfinder. And although you get more shots per roll, you get the insane inconvenience of using a camera that is solely designed to be shot in this orientation, and then you have to use it vertically. I'm just going to point out that it is absolutely ludicrous to think that you can take pictures on 6x4.5 in the portrait orientation without using a prism finder, because not only do you have to look in from the side of your camera, you also end up with a subject that's upside down. So if you're going to use the A16 back, get one of the prism finders. They also have a couple of other backs. There's a back that has just one sheet of film in it, which is essentially for a test exposure at the start of a high budget shoot. They also have these super slides, 4x4 centimeter backs, and you get the kind of more unfortunate demise of 220 film, meaning that there are a lot of A24 backs floating around, which aren't really useful now. You can also get backs to take 70mm. They use those, I think, for things like sort of class photos, where you're going to take 500 pictures in the same conditions. The 70mm backs are the ones you see on the moon landing cameras, where they come out way further, and essentially, instead of having 12 shots on the roll or 24 on your 220 roll, you can have 50 shots, 100 shots. They get pretty crazy. All right, I think I can start wrapping up now. We've talked about these cameras for a while, but just in conclusion, I feel like there is some competition between something like the Pentax 6.7 or maybe the Mamiya RZ series, and I want to talk about my experiences with this camera and why it is a valid challenger despite being a bit outdated, despite the quirky aspect ratio. This is a camera that, with proper servicing, can last forever. The lack of sort of electronic circuit boards in it is a huge benefit. The modularity of it as well means that if something does go wrong with a lens, the lens can be replaced without the whole system going. The backs can be replaced without the whole system having to go. Something like the Pentax 6.7 doesn't give you that interchangeability. Something like the Mamiya RZ gives you a massive increase in size and weight for just that one little bit of extra negative. I can crop this to a 6x7 and keep the same weight and form factor rather than having to upsample everything. The Hasselblad is really a very flexible camera, and you can have it in this small little configuration for an easy, lightweight traveling thing. I mean, you can argue that a Rolleiflex is smaller and has a smaller footprint, but not really. I mean, obviously that's holding it vertically as opposed to horizontally, but they're not that big when they're at their smallest possible size. The fact that you can use this for macro work, the fact that you can use this for landscape work, you can put a super tele on and use this for wildlife work. As far as Hasselblad's concerned, they really did try and cover every base that people might be using their cameras for. I love the options and the fact that although it's not a Pentax 6.7, it doesn't have that 105 2.4 lens, it does have a flash sync at every speed. It does have the option to shoot 2 different emulsions at the same time. Well, not at exactly the same time, but you know what I mean. It is one of those cameras that is so old that if it was going to kind of go out of style, that would have already happened. The fact that people are still using them, the fact that they're still so readily available is testament to the fact that they did stumble across something that worked really well. So that's about it for this video. I hope that you enjoyed watching me ramble about these cameras for so long. If you did, leave a comment, leave a like. God, I sound like such a YouTuber saying that. But this was an enjoyable video for me to make. I do love using this kit, and talking about it is just almost as fun. Stay tuned. I think that my next video will probably be a different format to this, because I've just sat here and talked about it for an awful long time. So maybe next week you'll see me using it, and we can discuss images rather than mechanical quirks, as it were. Thanks very much. I'll see you next time.